All right, all right. Welcome everybody to another episode of Hot Seat Automotive Podcast. It's your buddy CJ here, talking about all things automotive industry, the car guy hobby, all the things that automotive enthusiasts are most interested in. This is the home of Real Gearhead Talk. Real Gearhead Talk. We talk about it all the time, guys. Welcome, welcome everybody. All my returning subscribers, you're welcome back. Thank you so much for being a part of the channel. Any guests out there, first timers, please give me a like and subscribe. Would love to have you as part of the community. Around here, we're all about automotive enthusiast talk. We love talking about exotic cars and classic cars, what's going on in the automotive industry, various manufacturers, new regulatory compliance matters, what's going on in the car scene, cool automotive events, rallies, road trips, you name it. All the things that real gearheads like talking about, that Real Gearhead Talk right here with your buddy CJ. Welcome, everybody. Guys, I am thrilled to be back. As some of you may know who follow me on the socials, by the way, give me a follow on Instagram, Hot Seat Gearheads. You guys know your buddy CJ was on a road trip. I was on a rally with Legendary Motorsports, Legendary Autosports, I should say. We took a road trip to the Amelia Island Automotive event. Big week down there. It's known as the Amelia. It's now part of Hagerty Insurance. And it's really, I'll call it what it is. It's a high-end car show in a series of auctions and high-end automotive enthusiasts, big money cars mostly, although you got a little bit of everything. I'll cover that later. But what I want to tell you is, guys, I did about 1,000 miles round trip on this incredible road trip, took my 2021 C8 Corvette. I covered some of that on the socials, like I said, and I may do a review of that whole event if you guys are interested and leave me comments. But tonight, I really wanted to get back to basics. I'm back at the home office here. You can see your buddy CJ is coming at you live tonight with a fresh episode. And tonight, this is a big episode. Now, why is it a big episode, CJ? I'll tell you why. Because we covering a big vehicle. Tonight, we talking about gearhead stuff. We talking about car guy stuff. But specifically, we're getting into a brand of truck and SUV that came and went and then came again, that has this incredible history. What are we talking about? We're talking about Hummer. And we're going to trace the roots of Hummer all the way back. We're going to go way back. Your buddy CJ is going to take you on a journey back to World War II. Believe it or not, we're doing it all tonight. We're doing it together. So stick with me. And we're just going to have a blast doing it. And guys, leave me comments, questions, thoughts. Anything you think. If you've had a Hummer, if you've owned a Hummer, if you got an opinion on the old Hummers, the new Hummers, if you were in the military, shout out for your service. If you've driven Hummers, the original Humvees, let us know. But guys, we're going to get right into this. Let's go ahead and do it. And what discussion about Hummers would be complete without going all the way back? So important, guys. I think if we're going to talk about Hummers, we got to go back to the origin. Okay, and what we're looking at here is a World War II era Jeep. Okay, and these vehicles were produced in very large quantities and used and beloved by GIs across the globe, across theaters during World War II. The service life of these vehicles was unbelievable. And there were various evolutions. It's beyond the scope of tonight's call to really get into these early Jeeps. But you had the original World War II era Jeep, then like the Korean Vietnam War era, you had the M151 Jeeps. So these things evolved, different manufacturers. There were multiple manufacturers. That second generation, that M151 Jeep, was a completely different animal, different chassis construction and everything, although looked very similar. There's a rich history to this vehicle itself. But the long story short here is that coming out of the Vietnam era, and by the way, they produced this style of Jeep, up into and including the M151s into the 1980s. So this classic Jeep design and its evolution continued for decades. And there were related vehicles as well. Tons of rich automotive and truck history in the military that ultimately influenced a lot of civilian operations as well, and a lot of civilian models, I should say. But let's get back to what was going on with the Jeep. And there were limitations to this vehicle, to this class of vehicle. Limited armor, right? Limited capacity, limited ability to carry passengers, payload, limited off-road capability. Just a whole lot of things that limited the usefulness of this vehicle in the modern theaters of war come the 1980s and beyond. So 1979, the Army issued a requirement for sort of a jack of all trades, next generation vehicle. Okay. But a couple things I want to talk about, because there were really three manufacturers there were a bunch of manufacturers that expressed interest, but AM General and a couple of others actually built prototypes. But even in advance of that, what discussion about the Hummer would be complete if we didn't take a moment to talk about this thing? Are you ready? As you guys know, and people who are new to my channel, let me tell you about it. People who've been here for a while, we look at things together. Look, this is what car guys do, right? We love talking about cars and trucks and the history of vehicles and our experience with them. So that's what we do. And I welcome your comments. Leave me those comments. I respond to all the comments I can. Guys, what about this thing? Lamborghini built a prototype together with a company called MTI, and they built this thing called the Cheetah, okay? This was limited to prototype and was, to my knowledge, was never really tested or validated by the US government. The Lamborghini Cheetah, although built as a prototype, was never actually tested, validated, run through the series, the battery of tests by the US government as a meaningful replacement for the Jeep. So it's become somewhat of a footnote to history, right? There's all kinds of rich history to this vehicle. I believe only one was built. I believe it does still exist somewhere. If you know where it is, leave me. If you've seen it, you've checked it out, leave me comments, post those pics, hit me up on Instagram, Hot Seat Gearheads as well. But guys, ultimately, after this kind of went nowhere, this prototype, Lamborghini did build their legendary, what is it known as, the Rambo Lambo, or the Lambo Rambo? No, the Rambo Lambo, which was the LM002, in limited production for several years. Lamborghini produced something similar to this, but it wasn't the Cheetah military vehicle per se. It was, dare I say, more of a civilized civilian version. But this thing is a part of the history, right, of coming out of that Vietnam War era into the 80s, where the US government was seeking its replacement for the Jeep. Certain manufacturers started to kind of foam at the mouth and excitement, so to speak, to pick up that $1 billion contract, right? So Lamborghini and MTI did not win the contract. Let's talk about who did. Let's look at this together, guys. So here it is, right? Here is that first generation, if you will, Humvee. And what are we talking about here? AM General won the contract with the US government to build the high mobility, multi-purpose wheeled vehicle, affectionately known as the Humvee, a bit of a colloquialism, if you will. But the Humvee was the winner. These things were built over the years. AM General built some 250,000 of these vehicles. These had approximately an 8,500 pound gross vehicle weight. Interesting things to note about these, I believe there were gas and diesel variants, although I believe the diesel was much more prevalent, beyond the scope to really drill into the full detail of all of the permutations and combinations and the variants of this vehicle that were produced over the years for the military. This thing has seen service in multiple wars. Of course, for many of us going back to the Iraq War, this thing was on television all the time. Of course, that's where many of us first saw it in action back in the day, just watching the news, right? The news coverage of the Iraq War. Of course, anybody who served in the military during this time was intimately familiar with these vehicles. But this vehicle was a huge success, and over the years has seen multiple evolutions and innovations, up to and including upfitting of armament and armor, all kinds of different applications and innovations. For example, I know that in certain theaters in the modern era, where there were the IEDs, the improvised explosive devices that would actually cause a detonation under the vehicle, they were ill protected. So that was a bit of a limitation. A lot of damage was done, and unfortunately there were casualties. They were able to successfully armor the sides of these vehicles against lateral attacks, or side attacks, if you will. Unfortunately, that limited the mobility of the vehicle and also had other negative impact on performance and other aspects and practicality of the vehicle, survivability of the vehicle and accidents. There are all kinds of other challenges. But nonetheless, this thing has had an incredible run as a military vehicle. And by the way, we got to mention, now that we kind of touched on the military history of the original AM General Humvee, what is replacing the Humvee? Let's take a look at it, guys. How about this thing, guys? What we're looking at here is the Oshkosh LATV, which is, sort of a light tactical all-terrain vehicle. Now, this thing is not wholesale one for one replacing all of the Hummers. Let's get that out of the way. This isn't replacing all of the Humvees, I should say, in the military. The Humvee is still playing a role, and there's sort of various vehicles who I think have replaced the Humvee in various capacities. I don't claim to be an expert on military vehicles, but I do know that these vehicles are much heavier and larger. For example, these have a 22,500 pound gross vehicular weight, as opposed to the 8,500 pound or so gross weight of the Humvees. So this thing's a bigger, heavier, beefier vehicle in every way. Look at the armament. You could just take a quick glance and know this is a much heavier vehicle. Interesting to note that this modern vehicle produced by Oshkosh also has an evolved version of the Duramax diesel. It's not branded as a Duramax, I don't think, but it is based on the Duramax. And again, we consider this vehicle sort of a partial replacement for the Humvee. So again, that's about all I'm going to say about this incredible vehicle. Looks ridiculous, doesn't it? Just looks intimidating. And shout out to all the servicemen who might be operating this. And thank you for your service. Guys, let's get back to the Hummer. Let's keep having fun tonight, because that's what we do on this channel. How did it come to be that Hummer became a civilian vehicle? And what we're looking at here is an example of the civilian Hummer, what eventually became known as the H1. A couple of things. Legend has it that the Governator, the Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger, I'll be back. You guys know who I'm talking about. Legend has it that in the 80s, Arnold Schwarzenegger was on set and producing his film Kindergarten Cop. Who remembers that one? Leave me comments if you saw Kindergarten Cop. Come on. Leave me comments if you know what I'm talking about here with Arnold Schwarzenegger. So the Terminator or the Governator or Arnold, whatever you want to call him, he sees this thing, right? And he says, I want a Hummer. And of course, you couldn't get a Hummer. No Hummer for you, Arnold. That's a military vehicle. I want a Hummer for personal use. I'll be back. I'm the Terminator. Anyway, guys, legend has it Arnold did exert his influence on AM General to produce a civilian version. So lo and behold, and by the way, reality says that going back to the 80s, there was a plan to produce a civilian version of the H1 of the Hummer. There were discussions about it. Okay. Probably a lot of moons had to align, including a lot of the public's interest coming out of the Gulf War, so on and so forth. Having said that, 1992, the first civilian Hummers were produced, okay, known as the H1. Arnold Schwarzenegger bagged the first couple, and it was to much media fanfare. Okay, they only produced about, in the total lifetime, guys, this wasn't a huge seller. They produced about 11,000 of these. We're talking about a highly impractical statement vehicle. We're talking about a highly impractical rich guy vehicle. Okay, this wasn't going to be, your average truck person or your soccer mom, if you will. You had to have means. Like back in the day, I think these came out with an MSRP of about $70,000, which adjusted is like $140,000, $150,000 in today's money. This is a big money vehicle when it came out. Okay, I remember when these were first announced at that price point. Of course, I was fascinated by it, and we were all Arnold Schwarzenegger fans. He was one of the biggest celebrities in the world in that era, right? And, it just sounded astronomical. $70,000 personal vehicle just blew my mind as a young person back in the day. And as I said, over the total run, they produced about 11,000. Guys, I want to show you the one to really have ended up coming out in 2006. Let's take a look at this. At the end of the run, which by the way was 2006, so you figure 92 through 2006, they produced something called the Hummer H1 Alpha. And this really was the ultimate evolution of the civilian Hummer. And these have really come into their own as collector's items. And these are commanding a super high premium. Who out there knows about the Hummer H1 Alpha? 2006, this had a higher output engine and a bunch of other upgrades and enhancements over, previous versions of the H1. This is the one that has become most desirable to collectors and to enthusiasts. These vehicles do have a following, and you will see if you look at the market, these are big money vehicles now. The ones that are true survivors that haven't been hacked up and cracked up. These are definitely desirable on the market. So there is probably, like so many other vehicles, there's probably a Hummer H1 for a wide range of budgets. You can get legit Humvees from surplus. You can get former military surplus Humvees that have been converted, dare I say, resto mods for the street. You can get a Survivor 1992 through 2006-ish Hummer, civilian Hummer, but the 2006 version, known as the Alpha, is the most desirable, the highest performance, all the upgrades, just about everything you'd want in a civilian Hummer. But sadly, it was also the end of the run. So that's a bit about the H1. Guys, let's get into what happened in 1999. So in 1999, it was kind of interesting. General Motors bought the rights to market Hummers. Okay, so the H1, the Hummer, still to be produced by AM General. But General Motors was going to become the marketing and distribution machine, if you will, to really push Hummers to the next level. They'd had some success, but the idea was, given market conditions, GM saw the demand and the opportunity to move more units and to drive revenue by potentially expanding the line beyond just the civilian version of a fighting machine, the civilian version of the military vehicle, which was the Hummer, right? Also known as the H1 ultimately, which was a direct descendant and very similar, nearly identical, to the Humvee. Okay? General Motors said, we got an opportunity here. So General Motors bought the rights to market Hummers. And who remembers, guys, leave me comments if you remember Hummer dealerships springing up. I remember seeing and visiting Hummer dealerships. Like that was a thing. For some of you young cats out there who maybe haven't been in the hobby very long, believe it. There were Hummer dealerships. Is that crazy? How long ago was that? It just seems like forever ago. It's almost hard to believe that there were actual Hummer dealerships, but there were. Hummer was its own brand. Okay. And, it just became such a big thing. It became a part, it became a cultural icon. We started seeing these vehicles in films, in pop culture. Okay. These Hummers were everywhere. So ultimately, guys, what we're talking about here is the expansion of the Hummer brand by General Motors to offer multiple vehicles, leveraging that success of the H1 and the awareness of the brand and that identity. General Motors came out with a couple of other vehicles. Let's take a look at them, and they're just really fascinating. First things first, who remembers the H2? Let's talk about the Hummer H2. Okay, this thing came out in 2002. It has some of the styling cues, the boxiness, and the look of the H1, but this is not a military vehicle. Those that know, this thing was not based on the military Humvee. This is not really an evolution at all of the H1, the civilian version of the Humvee. What this is General Motors leveraging the platform of the Chevy 2500 and 1500 pickups, heavier suspension, I believe, up front, and then out of the 2500s, and out back out of the 1500s. That's my understanding. You had some similarity in components with existing General Motors Chevrolet truck platforms, the Tahoe platform, the half-ton, the three-quarter-ton pickups. The most notable thing about this is the styling. Make no mistake, you had those short windows, you had those, the width, the height, the chunkiness, that robust appearance, unmistakable. The H2 did not look like anything else on the road, although it had styling cues to remind the buyer, the consumer, of the H1. So there was brilliance in that. And at the time in the market, guys, before the economic crisis of 2007, 08, 09, ultimately the bankruptcy of General Motors and the decline of the automotive industry, especially out of Detroit, really a sad story. But before that, at the time that General Motors launched this thing, their timing couldn't have been better. I mean, they sold somewhere on the order of 150,000 or so of these H2s. Okay, the price point was high. You're looking at a $50,000 plus vehicle at the time it came out, MSRP. Okay, and really these things were competing with the Escalades of the day. These were a status symbol. Okay, whereas the H1 was a real statement vehicle, and it was a legit rich person vehicle. Okay, you had to have significant means, and you had to be able to use a completely impractical vehicle, or maybe you had it for promotional purposes, or it was just for fun. You couldn't really daily an H1, although I imagine some people did. There was a lot of impracticality to it. The idea of the H2 was that it was a big, heavy SUV, which, are you kidding me? Early to mid 2000s, this was the rise of the SUVs, right? Every soccer mom, every family, every contractor wanted one of these as a bit of a status symbol. This was your alternative to the Ford Explorer or the Expedition or the Excursion or the Chevy Tahoe, or as I mentioned, the Cadillac Escalade. These things were sold at a premium. Okay, this was not an inexpensive vehicle. Also wasn't inexpensive to operate. They did not get good gas mileage. You didn't buy one of these for gas mileage. You bought it as, again, a bit of a statement, but at a price point that the a much larger segment of the consumer population could afford these vehicles. Still an expensive vehicle, but and it was certainly at a premium over Tahoes or Explorers or Expeditions or other common SUVs at the time. I claim this was really a direct competitor with things like the Escalade or a Denali, or even like the G-Wagon. Now, the G-Wagon you might want to compare with more of an H1 in terms of price point, but again, kind of catered to that same market. I've got a bit more disposable income. I don't want to be like everybody else. I want to make a bit of a statement. I can't quite afford an H1, and even if I could, it's really impractical. A lot of folks went for the H2s, and they did sell quite a few of them. So that's a bit about the H2s. They sold what was known as the SUV version and the SUT version. Who remembers? This image actually happens to be an SUT. It's got that little truck bed out back. It was also available with the boxy wagon version, where you had an enclosed rear storage area. So I think they vastly sold more of the SUV versions. I kind of think the SUT versions are a bit more cool style-wise. But in terms of practicality, certainly the SUV version with that fully enclosed rear storage, probably a bit more practical to own. Guys, let's talk about the third vehicle that they produced. And ultimately, let's also talk about one that they were developing at the time that they unfortunately got shut down. But let's take a look at this thing. Now, this to me is perhaps the most interesting and, dare I say, the most practical, perhaps the most desirable of everything that came out from Hummer during the General Motors era, if you will, the first era. The H3. Now, the H3 was not certainly not based on the Humvee or the civilian H1. It wasn't based on the H2 either. What it was the H3 was based on Chevy Colorado and GMC Canyon vehicles. These things were produced through 2010 in both the H3, kind of enclosed wagon version, and then this, which is the H3T, the pickup truck version. Now, in total, they sold about 150,000 of these as well. But interestingly enough, guys, the pickup truck versions are the most desirable and the most scarce. Now, did you know that they only produced about 2,700 of these pickup models? And I know I've had friends over the years that I've met randomly. A couple of guys in particular come to mind who I didn't even know were automotive enthusiasts, but were very excited to tell me about their H3 pickup trucks. And I said, wow, that's a unique vehicle. These are desirable by a lot of folks in the market. One, they didn't make many. They didn't sell many. I think this was a 1 or 2 year model in the pickup truck format before everything melted down with General Motors and the economic crisis. These were kind of interesting, though, as I mentioned, based on that Chevrolet Colorado and Canyon platform, a bit more manageable in terms of size, but almost as capable as the H2. When you look at some of the tests that various organizations and media outlets put the H2s through, if you look at the testing with the H3s, they did pretty darn well. Off-road capability, so on and so forth. So you didn't lose much by going with the smaller platform. You still had that really cool, unique styling that kind of sort of harkens back to the H1. But make no mistake, this was not a fighting machine either. This was not a military vehicle. Okay, this was GM capitalizing on the brand, the image of the Hummer, but it was anything but, a distant cousin even of the original Humvee. This was a bit of a pose as well from a styling standpoint, but actually quite capable and a bit more practical than an H1 and an H2. Interestingly enough, it had an i5 engine, okay, inline 5-cylinder engine, and you could kind of categorize this as a bit of a shrunken or a dehydrated H2. Come on. What do you guys think? Now, guys, a couple things happen that I think are just really tragic here. And when I say tragic, I think more broadly related to the economy at the time that led to the ultimate demise. So let's take a look at this H1 Hummer as we talk about this. But guys, by the time, 2007 rolled around, there was a significant economic downturn going on in the macro economy that trickled down and had a grossly negative impact on Detroit and the automotive industry. So what happened was, consumer appetites were changing. There was a lot of backlash, significant backlash against the Hummers. The sales began to tank. Okay. Ultimately, for example, if you think about what was going on in the market, 2006, Ford had to kill the Excursion, for example, another big, ridiculous vehicle that you could kind of compare with an H2 or maybe even dimension-wise almost with an H1. Detroit wasn't doing good, okay? Bankruptcy ruled the day. The meltdown of certain aspects of the financial markets, okay? The last thing consumers were buying were big, gas-guzzling, massive EVs, okay? And with the meltdown, Detroit, General Motors specifically, had to divest itself of a lot of things and had to liquidate a lot of assets and ultimately shut down all Hummer production. The last Hummers to roll off the line were actually H3s, okay? And at one point, there were just significant financial incentives as General Motors was trying to push all these things out of their system, so to speak. I mentioned the H1s were already a thing of the past after the 2006 model year with the H1 Alpha, but H2s continued for a bit, and then also the H3s right up till 2010. General Motors made an effort to sell the Hummer brand. A couple different false starts there. There was a company in China that General Motors was in the process of negotiating with. Those negotiations fell through. There was an Indian company, I believe, that was potentially going to buy these guys. They were also in the middle of developing the H4, which some of you may know was going to be sort of a direct competitor to the Jeep Wrangler. Kind of, if you look at what Ford Bronco is doing now, the Bronco Sports, the Broncos, the Jeep Wranglers, you've got Volkswagen bringing back the Scout. Well, years ago, going back to 07, 06, 07, Hummer actually had plans for what was to be known as the H4. They actually built a prototype, which some funny things happened and ultimately ended up being sold off and licensed to a company that produced sort of a glorified golf cart. But that's a whole other topic. Never saw the light of day as a production model, kind of unfortunate. But ultimately, Hummer shut down in 2010, and it was presumably gone forever, but not so fast. Guys, let's talk about this thing. We as Americans and as car guys, we love a good comeback story, don't we? I do. I think you guys do as well. But guys, let's talk about this thing. What are we looking at here? Guys, never say never. The Hummer is back now as a vehicle offered under the GMC brand. Hummer is back. It's a bit different, though. It's a bit different than the Humvee from the military era. It's certainly a bit different from the civilian H1. It's not an evolution of the H2. We're talking about an EV here, guys. The new Hummer is actually an EV. This thing made its debut in 2022. This thing made its debut in 2022. MSRP around $110,000. $110,000, not an inexpensive vehicle. This thing weighs 9,000 pounds. This thing has about 1,000 horsepower and somewhere around a 300-mile range. It's got four-wheel steering, okay? Just a massive vehicle, and almost, kind of harkens back to, and as I look at it, kind of reminds me of an H2, but it's a ridiculously styled and aggressive H2, almost a reflection in the mirror of the H2 in some ways. Okay, but it's got that EV powertrain. So I actually looked at a few of these. There's a lot of these on the market. When they first hit the market, I believe these were commanding a significant premium, like in 2021. I think the days of the markups on these are gone. I haven't looked lately. Guys, leave me comments, but I don't think that this is an easy vehicle to sell right now. Given the slowdown in the adoption of EV in general, given economic conditions, the high cost of money, the interest rates are high. This is still an expensive vehicle, and it's an EV. So, you have to have a significant amount of disposable income to afford anything that's $110,000, $120,000, $130,000, $140,000. Number one. Number two, you have to be willing to buy an EV. And you have to be willing to jump on the EV bandwagon for something like this. Number three, if you've got the disposable income and you're willing to go EV, do you want something like this, which is about as extreme as you can get? It harkens back to the same buyer of the H2, right? Or maybe even the H1 back in the day, where it's somebody who wants a certain image, harkening back to that Hummer history and that heritage. Okay, it's a big vehicle, it's a utility vehicle, it's EV. So it's a unique cat that's going to buy one of these right now. We'll see where it goes. Did you know, kind of interesting to note, that General Motors placed a big bet on this thing? They built a $2 billion plus plant to produce these. Now, I don't know exactly what the broader plans are for that plant, perhaps to produce other vehicles as well. But I know that there's a huge investment, perhaps in my view, if you look at some of my other videos, I talk about it, sort of an overinvestment, particularly by Detroit, but not just Detroit, other manufacturers globally, whether it's Mercedes-Benz, whether it's Ford, whether it's BMW, almost an overinvestment in EV, and we'll see how it pans out, okay? But these Hummer EVs, let's see. I haven't seen that many on the road. Let me know if you have one, or if you have, let me know what you think about it. Let me know if you would consider buying one of these. But guys, that's the 2022 GMC Hummer EV, and we'll see what's next for this brand. Guys, I wanted to come on here tonight and talk a bit about the history of Hummer. I think it's a fascinating story going all the way back, if you can, tracing its roots to those military vehicles coming out of World War II, and then ultimately the Vietnam era and the replacement, the evolution of those vehicles, what ultimately became the AM General Humvee, that high mobility, multi-purpose wheeled vehicle, and then ultimately becoming a bit of a cultural icon, generating a lot of interest in the consumer realm and from Hollywood, for that matter, ultimately coming to market in 1992. And the rest is history, as General Motors acquired the rights to the brand and really blew it out, producing 300,000 plus vehicles, although ultimately economic downturn, financial crisis of 2008, 2009, the meltdown in Detroit, General Motors bankruptcy saw the crash ultimately in the dissolution of all things Hummer, only to come back in 2022 as an EV. What a story! What a story! And who knows what's next? Now, your buddy CJ, could I see myself buying one of those? No, I think the 2022 Hummer EV, I think if anything, I'd consider an H2 or an H3, but it would have to be a really cherry Survivor. I wouldn't want one that had been modified or donked out or any of that stuff. I'd want a fairly low mileage, well-maintained Survivor, okay? Fairly unmolested. That's kind of hard to find. Particularly I've seen with the H2s, a lot of them have been modified, ragged out, not interested. A lot of the H1s have kind of come into their own as collector's items. I mentioned that 2006 Alpha model. But again, you're going to spend a lot of coin to get one of those in really pristine condition. And then you've got a bit of a collector's item. So guys, I wanted to come on here tonight. It's good to be back. We're going to start producing a lot of content again this week. Thrilled to be back with you. Leave me your comments. Let me know what you think about Hummers. You got the original Humvee. You got the H1. You got the H2. You got the H3. You got the H4 concept vehicle. And then ultimately you got the GMC Hummer EV. Guys, what do you think about Hummer? What's been your experience with the brand? That's about it from me tonight. Your buddy CJ is going to sign off. Leave me comments. Give me a like and subscribe, and I'll respond to all the comments I can. Until I see you again in the next one, peace.